I'm going to pass over to Arya who's going to be chairing the debate. But just a little bit about us. So I'm the Secretary of the Oxford Forum. It's a policy debating society. We run a number of events throughout the term on a whole host of issues, from student finance to in conversations with certain politicians or people of interest, to Brexit panels. Next week, in fact, we have a panel on the future of German politics. So if that's something that interests you, go see that on Tuesday at Queen's. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Arya.
Right, thank you. And again, thank you all for coming. To start by introducing our speakers from your left, your right to our left, we have Dr. Andrew Lilico, who's Executive Director of Europe Economics and former Chairman of Economists for Britain, a pro-Brexit group of economists during the referendum campaign. Dr. Gudgin, former Special Advisor to the First Minister of Northern Ireland and Chief Economic Advisor at Policy Exchange, the UK's largest think tank. Dr. Heidi Maurer, EU Politics Lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Relations here at Oxford, and Senior Fellow at St Anthony's College. And finally, we have Will Hutton, former Editor-in-Chief of The Observer, Principal of Hertford College, and co-author of Saving Britain, How We Must Change to Prosper in Europe. Let's thank our panelists for being here today with a round of applause. In terms of the format for this evening, we'll start with 5-minute opening statements from our panelists on what they think is the best way forward on Brexit. Then there'll be a few questions from me before I open up the panel to questions from the audience. So we can start with the statements from your right to left. So Andrew, if you want to go first.
Fine, I shall go first. So the correct way forward on Brexit is we voted to leave the EU, so we should leave the EU. Often when people talk about the complexities of the current situation, they talk rather as if the vote in 2016 was for us to renegotiate our relationship with the EU, as if the point of that was to instruct us to go off and form some new deal with the EU. But quite the reverse was true. In fact, it seems like a long time ago now, but some of us may remember that through in late 2015 and early 2016, George Osborne and David Cameron went off and they said that they were going to find a new way for a new type of relationship with the EU for non-Euro EU members. And they came back with their deal and they said that it was a new special status that we got within the European Union. That was the renegotiated deal. So Cameron and Osborne went off, they renegotiated the deal, and then in the referendum in 2016, we decided whether we wanted to have that renegotiated relationship or not. Well, we decided not. We decided that we were going to leave the European Union. So some kind of argument that says what we voted for was to renegotiate is to get things exactly the wrong way around. What we voted against was the renegotiation. What we voted for was to leave, and we voted in leaving that therefore the EU relationship was to cease to be our single and dominant defining geopolitical relationship. Instead, we were going to go out into the world and do something else. We didn't say exactly what it was going to be, and of course you can't say what it's going to be because you have to go off and find what possibilities there are. Is it going to be that the United States wants to do some sort of deal with you, or are you going to go off and find something with Japan or Canada or Australia, who knows what? But we decided we were going to do something different. Now, of course, we found that there are some complexities with the relationship with the EU. It didn't need to be that way. The European Union should have been able to be more reasonable about things, but I don't entirely blame them for that. I largely blame those forces within the United Kingdom who've sought to frustrate the process of leaving the EU. Now, this is quite a serious matter for them to do that, because, of course, the vote to leave the EU was the single largest democratic vote in favour of anything that we've ever had in the United Kingdom. If you then say, well, although they decided that we were going to leave the EU, now we don't think we shall, we don't particularly care about the fact that they voted to leave the EU. What we'll do is either have some form of new relationship with the EU which amounts to remaining in the EU, or what we'll do instead is to leave the EU altogether, or even worst of all, would be to have Theresa May's deal, which breaks up the United Kingdom. But mercifully, that ghastly arrangement was rejected by a record 230 votes by the House of Parliament, by the House of Commons a couple of months ago, so I don't think there's much chance of that coming back. If we now say, well, we're going to frustrate the process, we're going to deny democracy, that's quite a serious matter. I mean, after all, why would anybody trust what happened in elections again in the future? If Jeremy Corbyn were to be elected, are we going to say, well, we think that's a bad idea to have a Corbyn government, so instead what we'll do is we'll leave Theresa May in the government and we'll give people a few more tries, 3, 4 votes until we decide whether they're really serious about it. That's no way to conduct yourselves in a serious, mature, alleged democracy. Think also about the message that we send out to other countries around the world, to dictators in third world states. Every dictator over the globe is going to say, whenever they find that there's a vote that they don't like, they're going to say, oh, the opposition, they lied, or there were a few irregularities with their expenses, or they said that they would do something, but it's not actually feasible, so we don't need to do anything. After all, the British did that, right? So why is it any different for us? It would be an absolutely catastrophic blow to the whole principle of democracy if we now say, although we voted to leave, we're not going to do it. I think that this is a very serious matter and people should not underestimate what the dangers would be. It's not merely dangers of the collapse of our whole political system. We've already seen that the Labour Party is in total collapse. If, in due course, Theresa May decides to cancel Brexit, as it seems she might, we will then find that the Conservative Party collapses as well. A truly epochal event for a party that's been the main protector of our constitution these past 190 years. If we find that this is the way that our system goes, that we just smash everything in the desperate attempt to stay in the European Union, to go back and beg them that we might have the privilege, the gracious favour of being permitted to remain, that would be absolutely catastrophic, not only for us as a country, for our whole political system. I suspect it would lead to Scottish nationalists and Irish nationalists deciding that they didn't want to be having with Britain anymore altogether. It would be a disaster. We voted to leave. The way forward is for us to leave. It really is as simple as that.
And now, Dr. Gudgin.
Thank you very much. Because of our history and geography and the nature of our economy, we've always been very different from the rest of the continent, and the UK has never really been a very comfortable fit inside the EU. Opinion polls have shown that right the way through. We're still the only member state of the EU that does more, the only large one anyway, that does more of its trade outside the EU than inside. We joined in 1973 on something of a false prospectus, a declinist prospectus really, that the only way for the UK to emulate the fast-growing countries of the EU6, as it was then, was for us to actually join. So we did join, but economic growth didn't improve. It stayed much the same, or it deteriorated a bit. What happened instead was that the growth of the EU6 halved almost, this is ironic really, it halved almost as soon as we joined. So since we joined, we've done almost as well, sometimes better than the EU6. But without us, without the UK improving in the slightest. So that's really undermined the rationale for us joining. We joined for economic reasons, and the expected boost to growth never really occurred. And as the EU morphed from a free trade organisation to an incipient United States of Europe, many in Britain have grown increasingly uncomfortable. And the result was the rise of UKIP, and of course the referendum itself and the referendum result. Now, many of my Remainer friends took the view that actually the EU wasn't that great, but on the other hand, with our opt-outs from the euro and our opt-outs from Schengen, we weren't in too bad a position and we could carried on. Now, I have some sympathy for that view. It's a kind of do-nothing view and don't upset the apple cart sort of view. And particularly my friends in Northern Ireland said, this really is going to cause problems if we vote for Brexit, and of course they were right. But the EU that we voted to leave isn't the EU of the future. Very many decisions are now made on what's called a qualified majority basis, so you don't have a veto anymore. And although it's had very little publicity in the British press, there's been a consultation over Christmas on removing the veto over taxation. So the Commission would be able to set, or at least put limits on, for instance, corporation tax rates. That's always been strongly opposed by the UK, and especially by Ireland, which of course is a tax haven. The whole basis of its economy is tax haven. But in future, it may not be able to stop that. French ambitions to build a European army and to have an EU budget, that's a central expenditure of the EU, are being held off by the Germans for the time being. We certainly don't want to spend any more money on the EU. But those pressures to build and centralise the EU state are always there. The UK therefore took a rational but difficult decision to restore national sovereignty, or at least fuller national sovereignty, before it became impossible to do so. This decision was strongly opposed by the government during the referendum, and Parliament, I think, we can safely say, is ratting on its promise to honour the result of the referendum. Much of the evidence presented by government institutions has been, to say the least, misleading, and the role of the Treasury in the whole Brexit campaign has been little short of a constitutional outrage. Civil servants serving pro-Remain ministers, and of course the Chancellors have been pro-Remain, cannot be independent, and yet the Treasury has been allowed to publish a succession of misleading reports on the potential impact of Brexit. Its short-term report said that unemployment would rise by 500,000. Unemployment has actually fallen by 250,000 over a 2-year period. And therefore the Treasury was not only wrong, it was stupendously wrong. We took to be 750,000 out on a 2-year forecast for unemployment is almost pretty well unprecedented. The long-term forecasts, which were repeated, by the way, in a government document only yesterday, were, in our view, just as bad. I'm part of a research group at Cambridge, which the introduction didn't mention. Perhaps you don't like to mention that people come from Cambridge. Anyway, I'll throw it. We're the only group to have fully replicated what the Treasury did. We found out exactly what the flaws were, how they managed not only to increase the size of the negative predicted impact of Brexit, but to increase it by something like quadrupling. Massive increase. Hugely exaggerated impact claims for Brexit. I think probably correctly, I don't like slogans, but probably correctly called Project Fear, have distorted and disfigured the Brexit debate. And government distortions and dissembling have been much more important in my view than anything written on the side of a bus, which was at least clear and was opposed every day during the referendum campaign. I'm thinking of all these silly predictions that we'll be short of food, there'll be food shortages, there'll be medicine shortages. And hardly anybody on the BBC or anyone else asks who exactly is going to stop these lorries. Are the French going to stop their own exports? HMRC said they're not going to stop anything on our side, they're going to prioritise free flow over any collection of tariffs. And in particular, I think perhaps the worst thing in the whole debate has been the treatment of no deal. Actually, no one on the BBC, in my experience, has ever been asked why they think no deal will be a catastrophe. Everybody says it'll be a catastrophe. Nobody's ever asked why it'll be a catastrophe, what their evidence is. I've never heard anybody ask that. Why should the average tariff of 3% for firms which are already fully compliant with EU rules and facing modern electronic customs clearing, why should that hold any terrors? What's catastrophic about any of that? It doesn't make any sense to me, but it won't be debated. The whole strategy is just say it's catastrophic, move on quickly, don't discuss it. If we could use a 3-month delay to actually debate this fully, have a proper national debate, I might even support delaying. But the delay, of course, undermines the UK's negotiating position, and it prevents a sensible outcome along the lines of what's called the Malthouse Compromise. That's based on a free trade agreement and modern customs technology. And the extension can only have one purpose, really, and that's an attempt to overturn Brexit and to do the sorts of things that Andrew Lilico was talking about, with the consequences that he was talking about. The reverse of Brexit would, I agree with him, destroy what faith remains in the British political establishment, among at least half the population, probably more. it could well destroy both the Labour Party and the Tory Party and reverse the UK's position as the only country, perhaps Portugal might be an exception, but virtually the only country with a thriving social democratic party and the only country without a strong populist opposition. Those who wish to reverse Brexit should take a deep breath, in my view, and consider the consequences of what they're trying to do.
And now we'll hear from Dr. Heidi Maurer.
Okay, thank you very much. I will take a bit of a broader perspective, also because I'm not British, I'm not going to comment on British politics, but I'm now living in the UK since 1.5 years. So many of my European colleagues made a lot of fun of me that, yeah, you're the only one who decided to move to Brexit country. I still find it fascinating because I'm a political scientist. And I probably never had so many politics discussion about European cooperation, European integration, politics, the role of democracy, the role of national parliaments than in the last 1.5 years. When looking at the question, what best action to take for Brexit, I was thinking a lot of, well, what does it tell us about politics? And I think if there's one thing that Remainers and Brexiteers and everyone else who doesn't know what they think has in common is that they are unhappy. They are not unhappy with the way political processes work. They are unhappy with the way a country, but also the UK and the EU member states try to come to a compromise. So I really want to focus a bit more, why is it so difficult to cooperate in today's world? And I was thinking, if we want to think of, well, what is the best action forward, it's always good also to look back and actually think of, well, what actually didn't work so well. And what I think surprised me the most in the last 2 years, observing the Brexit process, is that there's not a lot of change. There's not a lot of improving the political discourse, the arguments, the idea of talking to each other. And I think if there would be 3 things I would say, perhaps we should remind ourselves a bit. I formulated them a bit extreme, but I would say, stop hiding behind smoke screens, stop lying, and stop failing. And I think that goes for both sides. It goes for the UK side, but it also goes for the European side. Let me elaborate a bit. So one thing that I find fascinating is that our politicians very quickly went back to business as usual. The Europeans did it by outsourcing the negotiations to the European Commission. We do it according to the rule book. In the UK, we get one vote after the other, and we don't know. Let's wait now for 13th, 14th, or 15th of March if we have a Brexit or not, or if we have a no deal. What I find fascinating, it makes our politicians and civil servants look like they do things. Really? After 2 years, we still don't know what's going to happen in 30 days. This is a major catastrophe of politics. And perhaps we should, stop pretending that any actions that are taken on either side are actually leading us anywhere. So that's my first thing. The second thing with stop lying is perhaps a bit overemphasized. I would say, let's start distinguishing opinions from arguments. And again, here at the university, I think we should be more and more trained in saying, okay, so apparently Brexit is not going to have an influence on our economy, really? Well, I've read actually a lot of data and a lot of studies that say different things. I'm not an economist, I have to judge the sources as good as I can, but nevertheless, there are a lot of sources that tell us it will be a catastrophe for both sides. Will it hurt the UK more or the EU? If this is really the most important question, I'm sorry, then we really have a problem. Because that brings me to my third point, and that's the point about stop failing. Our politicians at the moment pretend that no deal is a policy solution, and I think they disagree. No deal is not a policy solution. If you don't get an outcome in negotiations, it means that you failed in politics. It means that you didn't manage to find a compromise, and that's what politics is about in the end. It can't be just to say, I want this, and I only want this, and I repeat this for 2 years on both sides, and in the end, we just walk in parallel lines. Politics is about compromising, about finding solutions that in the end try to make both sides happy, or in the case of Brexit, worse off, but that try to come to a negotiation. And what I found very interesting, I was asked in one of the interviews, yeah, but is no deal not like a divorce? And I was like, no, no deal is not a divorce. No deal means that we decide, we were married, we decide we don't like each other anymore, but I don't tell you, and I just pack my things and run out of the house, and perhaps put the house on fire. That's what divorce is. A divorce means that we have a withdrawal agreement. And of course, there can be disagreement of what should be in this agreement. But it means that you leave things in order. And that brings me now to the 3 positive points that would say, in the way forward, what would I hope that politics brings to the table a bit more? And the first one is start reconciling. Let's start actually talking about what do we want. And again, what fascinates me in the last few years, I didn't hear so many things of what actually UK politicians have in terms of vision. Yes, the UK wants to be a sovereign country again. But how? How does it look like? How will they achieve that? Same on the EU side. Okay? Yes, okay, we will make it work without the UK, but how? Let's be specific and let's really think of what is it actually that makes us so different. Let's also start reconciling society, and that brings me again back to this idea of, well, let's not only push up opinions, but let's finally have arguments with evidence attached to it. Let's also reconsider the concepts that we're using. One thing that still frustrates me the most is this constant notion of who is winning and losing in the Brexit game. It's about cooperation. Cooperation in its very element is not about who wins or loses. It's not a zero-sum game. But very often it's portrayed like this. And what I find as particularly frustrating in this Brexit discussion, it's always, well, are we winning more than the Europeans? If we give in, are the Europeans winning? If the Europeans give in, are we winning? It misses the point, and I think that's also our role as academics to question this concept and say, actually, we use a totally wrong concept in explaining of what's going on. That brings me to the third point. That's about taking responsibility. And taking responsibility can mean, yes, we have a leave vote. So the people want to leave, so we are arranging it. But do it responsibly. When my colleague said, it is no way to conduct yourself, to ignore the democratic mandate. Yes, but it's also no way to conduct yourself in international relations, to smash the door on your friends and, pretend that in the end you don't want to talk to them anymore. So I think we need our politicians to be much more responsible. And the last point that I want to make here is one thing that I find most frustrating in the current European politics is we're spending so much time discussing our differences, whereas there's so many things happening in the world where we should pay attention to, and we don't have the time and the effort and the capability because we're still trying to figure out what the UK relationship is going to be. Thank you.
And finally, we'll hear from Gudgin.
Okay, thank you. Well, the best way forward on Brexit is to not have Brexit, to argue and argue and argue, as we should do in a democracy, about the case for staying in the European Union. One referendum is not the voice of the people for all time, to which was genuflect before all time. We, in a democracy, constantly revisit our decisions. We do it in representative democracy, in regular general elections. I see no reason why a referendum held final say, if you want to call it that, in the autumn of 2019, 3.5 years after the vote in 2016, should be regarded as such a democratic outrage. General elections are held periodically every 4 or 5 years, and when you hear these terrifying tales of social unrest and all the rest of it, what you're really hearing is the terror of actually hearing the people speak a second time when they know what they didn't know in 2016. They will vote to remain. And that none of them, all these Brexiters, don't have the balls to actually put it to a vote a second time, because they guess, and in their heart of hearts they know they'll lose it. And one of the reasons they'll lose it was because of the kind of disingenuity of the way the vote was won the first time round. There were two campaigns, vote leave the EU, and one was kind of try and stay semi-official, one went wild. We were told variously that we were going to stay in the single market and the customs union. I know Michael Gove saying that a week before the referendum. We were told we're going to save £350 million, we were going to come back and we were going to spend the NHS, etc., etc., etc. Everyone knows the story. And of course, the appeal, and one has to call a spade, a kind of neo-racist appeal against immigration. The famous poster of lots and lots of faces, none of them white, trying to get into the UK, that Nigel Farage suspended using because of the sad death of that MP just a few days before polling. So, why can't we have a final say on what is going to emerge, which will be either Mrs May's deal or staying in the European Union? Those are the choices. Now, why am I against Mrs May's deal? I'm against Mrs May's deal because it is, in fact, the hardest of hard Brexits. We leave all Europe's economic institutions, the single market, the customs union, the agencies, all of it we leave. We attempt to construct a free trade agreement in this transition period, which we know will be second best to what we currently have. And we try to compensate for those losses by trying to do trade deals with protectionist China, protectionist Make America Great Again United States, and protectionist India. And we know that the kinds of things in which we have comparative advantage as a country, services, are areas which they systematically block us. Now, you know, economists for Brexit, one of whose luminaries is a man called Patrick Minford, who's never said by the Brexiters, but actually it was a bunch of economic forecasts written for 2018. And using the kind of thinking that kind of Andrew was so eloquent about, Patrick Minford applied the kind of boom that he thought was going to come, the first stage of the boom that was going to come from leaving the European Union. The devaluation of the pound was going to stimulate lots and lots and lots of exports, so there was a big net trade effect. Britain was going to, our trade balance was going to halve, our deficit was going to halve. There's going to be an investment boom as actually companies began to tool up for the wonderful, wonderful opportunities of global Britain 2.0. Whose economic forecast was bottom, completely bottom for 2018? Patrick Minford's. Why? Because the kind of thinking which Andrew champions is wholly wrong. And Graham actually talking about the disgraceful slurs against the Treasury and the Bank of England. It needs to be acknowledged that the camp which he inhabits produces economic forecasts in the here and now, which are derisory. Because actually, in a world in which you have integrated supply chains, there isn't actually a substantive kind of response to our exports to devaluation of the pound. Actually, what has happened is there's been disinvestment from the UK, a mass stampede actually out of the UK, highlighted by the withdrawal of the Japanese recently, the closure of the Honda plant just down the road in Swindon, the refusal to build the Train X up in Nissan, movement of Japanese headquarters to Europe is only just the tip of the iceberg. And indeed, some prominent Brexiters have been amongst the stampede themselves. There have been, Jim Ratcliffe wanting to move to Monaco, kind of for tax reasons, moving in Dyson, moving his headquarters to Malaysia and Singapore. I mean, these are not people who you can trust. You can't trust them. When it comes down to it, are they going to stand in this country for the consequences of the kind of havoc that they're wreaking on us? No, they're not. They scarper. Nor was this a vote, in my view, for kind of sovereignty in the way that was described. The way that the Leave vote maps onto social distress in Britain is almost one-to-one. One-to-one. The Northwest, the Northeast, the East and West Midlands, Yorkshire and Humberside all experienced falling life expectancy between 2014 and 2016. The mapping on of the strength of the Leave vote in not so much the cities, but in the smaller towns and rural communities is again stunning. It was left behind Britain, saying as loud and clear as they could to the prosperous people who are doing well out of the way the current structures in the UK economy are configured. We don't like it. We don't think that your warnings about this kind of slowdown or even recession make any sense to us, because actually things can't get worse than they currently are. There's a phenomenon that doctors in the United States have kind of established called shit life syndrome, where you take where people literally have falling life expectancy because they're mentally depressed, because actually objectively the circumstances in which they live are depressive. They take opioids. And actually a similar thing happens in the UK. 330 for every 1,000 inhabitants in Blackpool are prescribed antidepressants, because life in Blackpool is pretty bloody grim. Housing, education, training, sociability. It is a sociability black spot. We shouldn't be surprised that the Leave vote was 70%. And if you go around with Andrew and Graham around Blackpool and ask them about sovereignty and all the rest of it, that won't be the first words that come to their mind. The first words that come to their mind was, we were going to give the well-off in Britain a well-targeted and well-directed kick in the pants, because the circumstances of towns like ours is just unforgivable. We want change. And it was a cry for that, is how I interpret this vote, alongside profound fear of what was characterized as an uncontrollable flood of immigration. 3.5 years on, we know better. We're going to, when we have, and we know that actually the way that companies and economies prosper in the 21st century, not the 19th century world in which Patrick Minford and economists for Brexit inhabit, is actually the way our companies grow is actually having big markets in which the standards and the regulations and the safety of the products you sell align. Vodafone, well, now accounting for £1 every £8 distributed on a stock exchange, acknowledges that the only way it grew to become the company that it is today is because British regulations on mobile phones became European standards, became global standards. And between 2009 and 2016, this country made 86% of the regulations that came out of the EU were either ones we devised or co-devised. We had become, in the UK, the global standard setter via our membership of the European Union. And great companies like Vodafone, paying our dividends and our pensions, were able to grow in the slipstream of that. That will go with Mrs. May's deal. We become rule takers, not rule makers. We lock ourselves out of the single market. This university has got the best record for startups and scale-ups in Europe, better even than Cambridge. And those young companies that are starting up on ideas to be generated from our fantastic ability as a university to kind of leverage for Horizon 2020 monies and build research teams from all over Europe has allowed us to be some of the unicorns that have grown, like in my own college, Nanopore, founded by Hagen Bailey, required our membership of the European Union. What's going to happen to that possibility when we leave? Not only in Cambridge, but all around the country, the emergent hot economic spots are around our research-based universities. Startups, spin-outs, all of them relying on, one, the strength of the science and the imagination of our people, the kind of entrepreneurial courage, a kind of young men and women like you, but actually the access to European research monies and the access to European people to constitute the teams, and then the access to European markets, and then the ability to make those regulations become global standards. That's how you do industrial policy in the 21st century. That's how you get rich. This is not the imagined world of gunboats and exporting widgets, which is the basic economic model of economists for Brexit. So we must stay in the European Union. What we have to do on May the 14th is to vote down her deal. And then we have to say that there's no to no deal. And then on March the 16th, we have to say that we will only pass her deal if the Conservative Party agree with the principle of final say by the people, in which we put her deal, or staying in the European Union, to the people, and we will win it. We will win that decisively. But when we win it, we have to accompany the case for remaining in the European Union with a really powerful programme of economic and social reform to address the inequities and the desperation of so many of our fellow citizens who actually voted Brexit. They're not going to revolt in the way that they're described. You know, when we actually lay out what we on the Remain want to do with our country and the way we see our future, how we want to make common cause with other kind of middle-sized countries in Europe, because our values say, under threat from American protectionism, under threat from Chinese authoritarianism, under threat from Russian neo-fascism, it's in Europe that there are common values that we should stand by. It is a peace project, it is a growth project, it is a trade project, it is a values project, it is a project for you, young people, in the 21st century. Thank you.
We'll now move on to a few questions to the panel from me before we open this up to a Q&A from the audience. I'm going to keep my questions fairly general, based on a few things that were raised during the discussion. I'll leave the partisan criticism for all of you. So, to start with, in terms of the current situation with Brexit, we know that Theresa May has now revised her Brexit timetable with a vote on her deal on the 12th of March. She's agreed to offer a vote on whether she can leave with no deal on March 13th, which is something that Andrew and in particular Graham pointed out might not be a disaster. And failing that, a vote on March 14th as to whether we should delay Brexit and delay Article 50. So from that, what do each of you think will be the most likely outcome of these votes? And do we think that there's any hope left for May's deal, or should we just throw it away? Go from it.
Okay, so I think that, so taking those things in order, I think that there will be some movement on May's deal, but it won't be nearly enough. 230 is an absolutely unprecedented vote against. So the highest vote previously were 2 votes in the 1920s, about 160. Largest one that happened in modern times was 81, loss in the 1970s. 230 years, off the chart, catastrophic. I mean, any time probably through the past years, a government facing that would probably have resigned, losing a vote on a government motion of 230, probably ought to resign. There will be some movement, because some Conservatives will panic. They will say, well, it's better to have some kind of thing than to have Brexit cancelled, because that's likely to be what the government does instead. And they also may say they may not want to, they may see that means the end of the Conservative Party, and they may not welcome that as a consequence either. They might think it's better if the Conservative Party survives, but the country's split up a bit. But it won't be nearly enough, because the independent group people will continue to vote against. Labour's now committed to a second referendum and will vote against. Most, and you'll get a sufficient block of the Conservatives will continue to vote against. You'd have to have an absolutely enormous movement of them to panic, and it won't be enough. That's partly because it's pretty clear that what will happen if you, that's because of 2 things. One is, what will happen if we don't pass May's deal is that Parliament will vote first to extend. Once, if it can, the EU is not guaranteed to accept that. The French today said, for example, that they were unlikely to accept an extension unless the UK's position changed. There may be some attempt to switch to a permanent customs union and some kind of deeper relationship. That kind of thing would also mean the end of the Conservative Party, and any kind of Remain, Brexit in name only, non-voting Remain arrangement will also destroy the Conservative Party. And so they will either then remain as a non-voting member, they might vote something like that through, or just extend indefinitely or cancel Brexit altogether or have a second referendum. The worst of those options is the second referendum, by the way. That will not in the end change whether we leave. And this is also a reason why that will continue to be rejected. Remember, in 2016, one of the key arguments was of the Leave side was that it was inevitable that we were going to leave in the end anyway, because we were semi-detached. We'd become semi-detached for many years. We hadn't joined the EU's major projects like the Euro, the Schengen area. We weren't going to participate in the development of other aspects of the single European state, an elected president, a common treasury function, the coordination of taxes and other kinds of things. So we weren't going to stay in the longer term, because as it moved to the development of the single European state, it was going to be totally intolerable. Instead of the arrangement that we'd had, where we had been dealing with reasonably equally sized partners, and there was a bit of give and take, we were instead going to move into a situation where there was one massive Eurozone single European state, and we were an adjunct to it, continuously dominated and overruled all of the time, and so we were inevitably going to be leaving. What will happen if we cancel Brexit for now is merely that we end up leaving either when the inevitability of that arises, or when people again are reminded of the fact that that's inevitable. So it's just a mistake to think that there is any realistic Remain option. The relationship that we've had in the European Union is gone. The European Union is forming into a single European state. That's a fantastic idea. I'm all in favour of a single European state. They have no choice but to do it as well, because it's the only way to achieve a governance that makes the Eurozone stable. If they don't increase their political integration, the Euro will collapse, and they know that. I think that, for those kinds of reasons, those who are opponents of May's deal will continue just to vote against by and large, because they won't fear that cancelling Brexit now means that we don't leave, because that is written. That is a done deal. The only question of the 2016 referendum was when.
All right. Graham.
Winston Churchill once described his career as a history of ratting and re-ratting. And that's pretty well what we've got here from Will Hutton and his Remainer friends. There was a solemn undertaking, a very clear undertaking, that the result of the referendum would be honoured. And of course they want to dishonour it. I think what will actually happen is I think we will go to an extension. I think that's the logic of the current situation. But the extension will be there to give Remainers like Will the chance to overturn Brexit. Have a look at today's Financial Times. It comes in straight after the Prime Minister's announcement, saying, "Here's our chance. We can overturn it now. We can go to second referendum. We can get rid of Brexit. Here's what to do." So that's what they're up to. It's very nice, though, to have a chance to actually agree with Will Hutton on something. It's a very rare event for me, I'm afraid. And I agree that there is no way in which anyone should support the Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. It is a thoroughly bad outcome for the UK. In fact, it's humiliating. I can't imagine that anyone who would support it has actually read it. Would it be unfair to ask for a show of hands? How many people here have read the withdrawal agreement? It's only 560 pages. Anyone? Not a one, no. I think even if you asked MPs if they read it, you wouldn't find that many who have read it. Or indeed the political declaration, only 56 pages that accompanies it. If you do read it, your jaw sags on it on almost every page. What is being described is associate status for the UK, as if we were Moldova or Bosnia, something like that. The key thing that the EU wants out of this is to constrain the UK's economic competitiveness. They don't want us to have the freedom to be able to set tariffs or to have different regulations from them, particularly in areas of environment and labour law. So these documents tie us down, a bit like Gulliver in Lilico, tied down all over the place. So we certainly shouldn't vote for that. How any self-respecting government or Prime Minister of the UK can have agreed such a thing is, well, let's leave it to the historians, but it's a very sad and difficult story. So yeah, vote down the withdrawal agreement. When I talk to MPs in the Leavers European Research Group, they still expect this to be voted down. May not be by a majority of 230 this time, but still voted down, and then we'll go through to an extension. And then nothing will be settled. We're just fighting on. People will try and fight for a second referendum. Other people will try and block no deal, and we'll come up again. At the end of May, and pretty well exactly the position where we are now. I'm told that if we get that far, we haven't had European elections or prepared for them, it would be very difficult to extend again. But in this weird world in which we are, I think probably some way might be found for us to extend and extend, so that Will and his friends can not only rat and re-rat, they can rat on forever.
Okay, we'll hear from Heidi.
Okay, thank you very much. As I said, I will not focus too much on British politics, but one thing that fascinates me, when I'm in the UK, I'm in one of my bubbles, and then I go to the continent, and I'm entering another bubble, and the two don't necessarily talk to each other. I think what you heard now is exactly the problem with the Brexit process. From the European side, all we hear is what the UK doesn't want, what the Brexiteers don't want. They don't want a withdrawal agreement, they don't want to be an associated country, no deal is bad for everyone.
We want a free trade agreement.
We don't.
Everybody says that.
Yes, for 2 years. But the problem with politics, again, and it brings me back to cooperation
forever.
is...
Forever.
Yeah.
And ever.
Yeah, that's fine. But the problem with cooperation is, you can't just come and say, oh, we just smashed the door in your face, told you for 2 years of how bad your association, your cooperation framework is, and then say, oh, and by the way, we want the biggest, best agreement ever, and pick all the cherries from the cake. In what world is this realistic? And in what world does this have anything to do with good politics? And that brings me, I think, to the main point, because I think so many people will now focus on March, and will there be a deal, what kind of deal? I think what we have to realize, this is just the start. If there's no deal, we will deal with the repercussions for years to come. And, there's bad regulation, there's bad governance, but the worst is if there's no, because then there's insecurity. And I'm not sure how many people you know that are not sure if they can stay in this country, if they can go to study in Europe, if they can use their phones, if they can use their driving licenses. All the businesses who actually don't know what's happening after March. That's, in the end, what no deal would give us. If there is a withdrawal agreement, we have to start talking about the free trade agreement. You think the EU was nasty so far? Well, good luck with negotiating with one of the biggest free trade agreements, with one of the biggest markets in the planet, who, by the way, has very good negotiators. That's why we gave it to the Commission. So what I really wonder sometimes is, we pretend like, okay, this vote is now the end. But we should come to an agreement in March that actually allows us, both sides again, to talk about the future. And that, I think, is what sometimes makes me really angry in these Brexit discussions. We pretend that we are enemies. But the UK is the European Union too. That's how the EU is constructed. And you might think that EU develops into a state. Yes, and there's a lot of criticism against it. But the way it is now, it is not. The EU can hardly do anything without the member states. And the UK was a very important partner for many years. Which, by the way, the UK managed to damage in the last few years quite dramatically. The amount of reputation and trust that the UK lost in Brussels in the last 2 years is not something that is talked about. So yes, you can say we go out with a no deal. Yes, we can go out with a withdrawal agreement. But I think we also have to recognize that politics is also about trust, about creating friendship, about coming up, with joint solutions. And you can't pretend until March that, we really don't like you Europeans and we want something else, and then turn around and say, oh, by the way, we want to create a really nice free trade agreement. I think this is not realistic, and this is simply, without any evidence that this would likely be successful. Thank you.
Finally, Will.
I'll just, two of the sentences that are cut so quick. First one, I really, I like, the two of them haven't responded to my challenge about, why are they frightened to have a second vote. Secondly, from Andrew, I'd like you to name, because you threw that line about how we were bullied by the European Union in this way. I'd like you to name kind of when we were bullied into doing something we didn't want to do. My point stands that kind of 86% of the regulations within the single market that were constructed in 2009 and 2016, we either altered or we were extremely comfortable with because they were actually what we wanted. There was no bullying going on at all. We were a rule maker, Andrew. And then just on his slightly, Graham is a nice guy. He's going like under his breath, he said, you know, there are environmental and labour law changes that we'll be able to make that actually we can't make as the European Union. Those ones will not be enhancing our environmental standards, and they won't be enhancing our labour law standards. They will be diminishing them. And as we will be required to do if we want to cut deals with the Americans, we're actually going to deal through both the Senate and the House, given the vast preponderance of votes from agricultural states. Any US trade negotiator has to insist on major concessions by us to their food and the way they choose to make their mass-produced food in the States, which is not very happy, and one of the reasons they have an opioid crisis. But that's one point. What's going to happen on March the 14th? I think it's going to be really quite, I take the point about the huge vote against the deal, but I think she's going to get some concessions from the European Union. And I think that as opinion becomes clear that actually a second vote will be on this will be won by the Remainers by a substantive margin. I'd expect a 55-45 margin or even bigger. People on the Brexit side will start thinking it's a terrible deal, but actually let's hold our nose and let's get out. And then once we've got out, we'll actually go for this free trade agreement and rat on the deal. And actually, to be a return, I'm not sure to be hardly. If my stance is seen as Churchillian, ratting and re-ratting, I'm quite comfortable to be thought it was Churchillian in this line. I mean, maybe Churchill, I think Churchill, a notable kind of European actually in that sense, never, I think, would have kind of signed up for the kind of Brexit agenda in the context of 2019. But we can debate that. So I think it's going to be quite tight on March the 14th. I mean, close analysis has been done, and actually the defeat if it's defeated, it could be defeated by 20 or 30 votes, I think, rather than a couple of hundred. And there's a number on the Labour side who I think will abstain, connived in by Jeremy Corbyn. There'll be a number of others who will vote for the deal. Caroline Flint has made it clear where she is on this, so is Lisa Nandy. You could find 20 Labour MPs voting for the deal. You could find another 30 abstaining on the Labour side, so that the number of pro votes the Tories have to muster is actually much lower than you think. I still think on balance it will get defeated, but don't think it's a slam dunk. Then the vote on March the 15th, assuming that happens, I think there's an overwhelming majority in the House of Commons for no deal. And actually it's very, very important that the House of Commons votes by 500 or 550 votes to 100 against no deal, because that takes it off the table. A no deal is an impossible proposition, and that'll be spelt out, and the government will spell it out, and actually the Tory party will spell it out, and even the Daily Mail and the Sun will spell that out. And the no deal will not be on the ballot paper for the referendum that will become the decisive vote on March the 16th. And then it's a complicated minuet that's going to take place. Two Labour MPs, what's his name, John Kyle and Phil Wilson, have proposed an amendment to be gathering force in which the Labour Party abstain on her deal so that it gets through the House of Commons, but contingent on a commitment to have a final say ratified by the people on her deal, or if we vote against her deal, the default option is to remain. And the third option of no deal is not on the ballot paper. Now, that is going to be that. Now, the prospect of that is really very high. And because the prospect of that is very high, it means that if you're a Brexiter, you've got to think very carefully how you vote on the 14th, because the sequence of events will be, if you vote down her view on the 14th, you open the way to people's vote of final say. Probably an extension which has to be longer than 3 months, because there's not time to get the legislation through for a referendum by the end of June. The Europeans would love us, they want two things. They either want us to have a small extension to do, to legislate for her deal if it's passed, and everyone understands that, or they'd like an extension to be a substantive one, 9 months to the end of the year, so that either a general election can be held or a referendum can be held in which actually it becomes clear what is the political complexion of the country with whom actually the sign-up is going to take place for a renegotiated deal or whatever will be in the respective parties' manifestos. So we're entering a period of extreme political turbulence, and I think one has to be extremely clear-headed at this moment in time. And I do think we have damaged our relationships with the European Union, but not irretrievably. I also think that one of the most difficult things is going to be whether or not and how we manage the question of representation in the European Parliament. Because if Britain remains a member of the European Union even until Christmas, the European Parliament is not a legitimate lawmaking body under European law if it doesn't have representatives from every member state. So they need British MEPs. We'd either have to decide to have fresh election, join the European elections, which would be pretty very difficult given that we haven't actually decided whether we're in or out, or we'll have to send delegations to the European Parliament, the European House of Commons like we used to, and that'll have to go through legislatures in Europe. It's all very tricky indeed. The last thing I want to say about this kind of imagined behemoth that is the European Union is that there was a constitutional crisis in Germany after the Lisbon Treaty, and the Constitutional Court in Germany had to rule whether the German government it would be legal for it to sign the Lisbon Treaty, and whether it offended the basic law in the Federal Republic, which sets up its democratic conventions, and actually that the primacy of lawmaking in Germany has to be the Bundestag and the Bundesrat, and that actually if there was any threat to the supremacy of parliamentary institutions in Germany, then actually it would be illegitimate. And the Constitutional Court in Germany decided that it was illegitimate because in German law, Germany is a member of, wait for this, an alliance of states, was how it was defined in German law. And Germany nor France got any intention of surrendering their democratic institutions, the fundamental sovereignty of their parliaments, their discretion to the supranational beast that is bullying us around. They don't. That's not the way that they see it. And actually, it would be one of the things that I think that we will have to do when we make the Remain case is, I think, when we rejoin the European Union, which we will do, there is no question. And we may leave, but I have no doubt that within your lives, the next 10 or 15 years, we will rejoin. There's no doubt about that. We have to be part and parcel of this community of nations that on our continent. And these boys are chasing a chimera, and that will be shown up in the years ahead if we do what they are suggesting. And so the country will want to do it again. But if we do it again, I think we have to have a similar relationship to the European Union, and we have to have our version of what the Germans have got in protecting fundamentally the sovereignty of their parliamentary institutions. We may have to write into the treaty that Britain's happy to join this community of nations, this alliance of nations, but actually Parliament is sovereign. And those are the terms in which we go back. We may also have to have some movement on the way freedom of people in the European Union is constructed, because we are going to have to tell those communities that are very threatened by the they see it, and by the way, they were high, that actually we can have control of our borders. I don't think, and those two things are going to be fundamental in actually making the case to remain. And we will get those concessions from our European partners. We will rejoin the European Union. We will fashion industrial policies that allow us to grow great companies and bring prosperity to our country. And we will formulate a social contract in line with European values that will actually turn around the fall in life expectancy and the kind of desperation in so many parts of our country that fed the Leave vote. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to open up to questions from the audience shortly, so we can have brief answers to final question. I'd like to ask Andrew and Graham one question, and Heidi and Will another question, based on some of the things you've said, although feel free to come in on each of those questions. To Andrew and Graham, I'd like to allow you the chance to take up the gauntlet that Will threw down in his speech there. We know the Labour Party leadership and Jeremy Corbyn have recently come out in favour of supporting a second referendum. Is the Labour Party making a mistake? And what is actually wrong, as Will would ask, with a second referendum?
Okay. So when we have a general election, we have another one later, and then another one some years after that, another one after that. But in between, what happens is that if you elect a particular MP, the MP that was elected is the one that serves as the MP. Right? You don't have an election and then say, well, we're going to the person who was the MP from 50 years ago is going to stay the MP until we've had 3 elections to get rid of it. There's no problem with having a referendum, no democratic problem with having a referendum to rejoin the EU after we've left. But once you've voted to do a thing, democratic principle is you have to do that thing before you have another vote. So I don't have a problem with having a referendum in some years' time to rejoin the EU. That's not a problem in principle. The problem is to say you choose to do something, the vote comes through, but we're not doing it. That is as undemocratic an act as it comes. That's absolutely the abnegation of your commitment to honour democratic processes. When there were other elections, when for example the European Union had multiple referendum for other member states, there were changes. So the Danes rejected the Maastricht Treaty in a referendum, but then they were given a change in the treaty, an opt-out from the euro. And that meant that they were then able to join. The Irish had a protocol about their neutrality added to the Nice Treaty after they'd rejected it. So that changed the treaty. In this case, nobody's suggesting that we're going to change our relationship with the European Union before we decide whether we're going to rejoin. There's no change in what's going on here. All that's being suggested here is we voted to leave, but we're not going to do it. That's the problem in principle. And I think that that's a very serious problem, and I'm quite surprised, actually, that the Labour Party, given how radical some of their policies aren't more nervous about that principle. I don't think that if I'm offering a hard left agenda, I want to establish the principle that if the establishment in Britain doesn't particularly like what I do, then even though I get voted, I don't get to get in control until we have a few more tries. I think that would be a very dangerous principle for them to apply. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a bit hard to see what Will Hutton's problem is. He thinks referenda on this sort of issue should be a bit like general elections. You should have them every 5 years. You can have another one after 5 years, yeah. 2021 if you want. Will says he's very confident that a referendum to rejoin the EU would be successful. Well, good luck with that. I'd take quite a big bet on that. But if he wants a referendum to rejoin the EU after we're out, I can't complain. That's fair.
It's not undemocratic.
Not undemocratic. But look, let's be serious about this. This was a properly conducted referendum. It was a serious referendum with a long campaign in which the arguments on both sides were put daily and strongly on all the media. And the government, in the documentation it sent to every household in the country at a cost of £9 million, promised that the result of the referendum would be respected. This is really quite important in the history of democracy. This has to be respected. We do have to leave. After that, Will can have as many rejoining referenda as he wants. I think I I may drop out of Brexit at that point. I think I've almost had enough.
Can I just add one quick other thing, which is that if we have the kind of kangaroo vote that Will Hutton proposes, Leave campaigners won't participate. Right? They're not going to participate in any. It's totally illegitimate. If you're going, and I also think it would be dangerous. So it will be illegitimate because, for the reasons which I've stated, Leave campaigners won't participate. By and large, of course, a few naive or eccentric people will participate, but by and large, mainstream people won't. And furthermore, a lot of people that had voted, sometimes for the first time, or voted in areas where they had very little trust in the political process, will be totally discouraged and won't participate. So what you'd have is, there's every chance that for those kinds of reasons, you just make a mockery of the whole arrangement. I think it would be dangerous to have a referendum. If you're going to cancel, you should just cancel. Because what will happen if we have a referendum is that for months at a time, we'll have these people going out and campaigning to remain. And you'll just invite the Tommy Robinsons of this world to go along with their yellow jackets and go along and mob, and then Owen Jones Renter mob people will come over and try to protect the Remain campaigners. And you'd end up with fights regularly. And we'll have the kinds of scenes that we've seen in France. 10 people have died in those Gilets jaunes protests in France. I don't see why we should think that we'd be immune from that kind of thing. That kind of violence could scar our politics for generations. It would be an absolutely disastrous idea. If you're going to cancel, for the love of God, just cancel.
They can't do that. They need you to vote for it. If you cancel, it's so obvious what they've done. They've overturned democracy. They need you to.
That makes it worse. Pretending makes it worse. It's enraging to pretend there's the slightest legitimacy in this. If you're going to just ditch democracy, then ditch it. Don't pretend you're doing something else. That's a classic strategy of every tin pot dictator in the world.
Well, I'm sure Will want to respond to this.
In a minute, yeah.
But I will pose my other question to both Heidi and Will, because I'm conscious Heidi in particular has a focus on EU politics with the academic work she does. My question would be, what do you think the future of both the EU's relationship with Britain and the future of the EU itself will be post-Brexit?
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I just want to make one more remark on this referendum parliament democracy discussion. Because one thing that I find difficult is in this idea that, well, if you don't allow for Brexit, you're against democracy. Really? In the end, what we see in the UK at the moment is that we have a referendum result and the parliament who votes differently. Because apparently MEPs think that the way, the implications, the disadvantages, the results of really having a Brexit would be too damaging to the country. So in the end, what you have, a tool of direct democracy and parliamentary democracy, so representative democracy, that in the end clash with each other. And that brings me now to your question. From the European Union perspective, the problem is we're waiting and waiting, and it's not the European Union's task to make sense of that, of what's happening in the UK. The big problem for the European Union is we can't think about a future relationship with the United Kingdom because we don't even know what will happen on the 1st of April. And I think that's where we see, again, politics really failing. It creates insecurity. How can really someone make a clear argument that they can come up with a plan for the next 5 years if they can't convincingly tell me what's happening on the 1st of April? I think that's the fundamental problem. Talking at the same time, we also, we should also not pretend that on the European Union side everything is running very well. Yes, we have European Parliament elections, and that's not good for the Brexit negotiations. Because there will be people who will point out, look at this mess. But we also will have people say, oh, we should join the UK in leaving. And it will be a very superficial discussion. We know from European Parliament campaigns that they're never about real European issues, but it's about national context discussions. Like referenda very often are. I remember still the constitutional draft treaty referenda in France and in the Netherlands. At this time I was living in the Netherlands. Yes, the Dutch rejected the Constitutional Draft Treaty, not because anyone had read the treaty or understood it. They just wanted to send a little signal to their government. And that's what they did. I think what we really have to think about much more is, what is this relationship that both sides want? So if Parliament doesn't like the withdrawal agreement according to May, well, you know, at some point, it's not good enough to say, oh, I don't like what I see. But what are the alternatives? The real alternatives, not the ones of, oh, we are a great nation who will now go around and negotiate a lot of free trade agreements with everyone who's waiting for us. Again, I think what is very clear on the European Union side is the UK leaving hurts the European Union. First of all, in terms normatively, it's not good if you lose one of the members of your club. It hurts the European Union also in international affairs. Can the EU now really go to some third countries and tell them about democracy promotion and good governance if every 2 minutes the partner can turn around and say, oh yeah, let's talk about Brexit again? It hurts the European Union in what it's able to do internationally. It also hurts the UK. And again, I think there we have to recognize, no matter what the future is, we have to start mitigating the negative effects that Brexit has on both sides, especially internationally. And I don't hear any discussion on that. And then we look around in the world. I mean, this morning I woke up and I was like, oh my God. Pakistan and India are just shooting at each other. Wonderful. Let's talk about Russia. Let's talk about the United States. There's so many topics where I'm pretty sure that the UK and the European Union have a joint interest. And very often, we don't even have different positions. We want the same things. But we can't start talking about this as long as this pickering is going on of what do we do on the 1st of April. And I think that's a real problem on both sides.
Will Hutton.
The question is, to me, is the same one, or?
Feel free to address either. I imagine you want to respond on the second referendum issue, but you can also talk about the useful relationship with Britain post Brexit.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that talking about Andrew and Graham, because I think that you can't exclude the fact. I mean, you can't exclude the fact that actually, a bunch of people feel that way. And it is one of the reasons why referenda are so tricky on such substantive issues as one's kind of place in the world, and a kind of an international network of treaties been built over 45 years. I mean, not having I wrote my first essay against the principle of referendum, and I was 15 actually, because it's so obvious that you get into this kind of bind, and we're in a bind as a country. I mean, and I can see if you were the winning side, how unpalatable it would be to have a second referendum to reverse the first one, for the reasons they've adumbrated. I've made my points, and you all can make your minds up in the Q&A session in a minute. What I would say is that they're incredibly dangerous. I actually think that it would have been so much better for there to have been a supermajority of 60% for a referendum on a major realignment of our place in the world, with all the dislocations that are going to follow. But the Labour Party didn't oppose it, and for all the reasons that we know, David Cameron wanted to have it to appease his right. He was overconfident he could win it, and we have what we have, and it's a mess. And I think again, I actually agree with Andrew and Graham in this point. I think that both major political parties are in terrible trouble. I mean, the Labour Party's problems are obvious, but so are the Tory Party's problems. I think Heidi is a very attractive kind of parliamentarian, and I can imagine her being elected leader of the independent group, and I can imagine a group of more Tories joining it, and it becoming the kind of not a kind of rival party to the centre-left paradoxically, but a kind of where one nation Toryism resides, and actually European Research Group, being kind of absolutely marginalised, who is to say? I mean, everything is so contingent on events, and I could equally imagine further defections from the Labour Party. And Labour Party's been harder hit by the independent group than the Tories and the polls, but I mean the Tories have also suffered. So there's, and it may be the case that we have to leave because for all the reasons that you've heard this evening, before we can actually legitimately remake the case for joining. And it may be that we have to go through kind of a veil of tears, as Dutch Prime Minister described it, before actually the country owns the fact that we're European, owns the fact that far from being an imperial power, and that those lost glories can be rapidly restored. A successive of free trade agreements which obviously were being screwed by the Japanese, and screwed by the Chinese, and screwed by the Americans, and already you can see it. I mean, Philip Hammond wanted to go to China, and Gavin Williamson made some threatening noises about an aircraft carrier going to the South China Seas, and the Chinese cancelled the visit and that was that. A letter from the Foreign Secretary, Liam Fox, to Miti in Japan. The next round of trade part nearly got cancelled because it was deemed to be impolitic, impolite, and requiring the Japanese to discard their interests. I mean, these free trade agreements that you were promised that were so easy to do, they're damn hard to do. And actually, our place in the world is going to be very diminished. And maybe we have to live through that. And I sometimes say to people, right-wing thinkers like Andrew and that body of opinion, which has there's a tradition in economics which strongly believes in kind of the impact of kind of deregulation, markets, and all the rest of it. That led to the financial crisis of 2008-9, and cumulatively lost GDP of 12 or 15% now as a result of that. And now that same thinking is going to deliver kind of either Mrs. May's hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, and if things go badly wrong, and we get another 10 or 12% cumulative loss of GDP. Because make no mistake, GDP will grow by 1.25% on average in the decade ahead if we leave. We have to live through that as a country. We have to live through being a diminished country before we can actually. I kind of get what they're saying, and I would like to avert that, and I would like the opportunity to avert that. I'd like to put my case to the Brits before the whole thing is done and dusted, and I don't think it's any democrat to do that. And if the second vote I lose it, and me and my friends, as I pejoratively called, lose it, I will have to respect the result, and I'll have to make the case for Remain, knowing that it can't be revisited for kind of some years. As for the relationship with the European Union, I think that you made excellent points. The European Union is diminished as well, but one of the paradoxes is that support for the European institutions has actually reached kind of 40-year highs in public opinion surveys of member states in the European Union, because suddenly the value of being a member is kind of absolutely crystal clear, kind of even to the populist right, like Orban in Hungary, and Salvini in Italy. They're kind of that, and actually it's interesting that Marine Le Pen has dropped the case for Frexit, because we don't want to get ourselves in the same situation as the Brits and that calamity. So there's been pluses for we're going to learn what the value of what they've achieved. But as a community of countries, it is diminished. It doesn't have the same clout as it had. It is less. And the whole damn thing is a pity. Thank you.
We'll now move on to taking any questions from the audience, if there are any. Okay, we'll go with you first.
So, thank you for your time. You say that, it seems like you're either purporting to say that we should have a second referendum, basically going through hard Brexit. The customs trade deal as it stands is bad. And my question to you from a game theory perspective, is it really? Because on one hand, I don't buy the legitimacy of a second referendum, and the fact that the EU seems like Hotel California, and going from one crisis to the other. But at the same time, I don't buy into the story that we can hope that we can slam the door shut on our partners, and at the same time expect them to give us something, good if we decide not to have any deal at all. So, that's my question to you. I mean, despite the terrible deal that it is, because, we've heard about it, although none of us have read it, obviously. What do you think about that?
Come back on that. Yeah, it's good to mention game theory because we're in a very delicate negotiating situation. By the way, Australian trade negotiators who've got decades of experience of negotiating with the EU told me immediately after the referendum, this is 2 years ago now, don't listen to a thing that the EU says until the last 3 weeks. All the action is there. We're just coming up to the last 3 weeks. And I think Will and his friends want to cut off that last 3 weeks. But actually, as we go into that last 3 weeks, the UK has got some significant bargaining chips. And we could end up with an agreement if we were able to bargain that was in both our interests. It should very much be in the interest of the EU, by the way. I don't think there's anybody on the UK side saying, look, we just want everything for ourselves. We want an agreement that suits everybody. What are those bargaining chips? One, of course, is the money. The second one is trade. The real problem comes in those sectors and industries where tariffs are going to be very high, so over 10%. That's basically cars and food. Now, the EU sells £55 billion worth of those goods to us every year. We sell £21 billion to them. They've got a big interest. It's only about 0.5% of their GDP. But it's quite a lot if you happen to be a car-producing city in the US or a wine-producing region in France. Those things are going to weigh right at the end. A lot of this isn't very well reported in the British press, but of course there are delegations already from the German car-producing cities to the Chancellor saying, look, hang on, this could be serious for us. The third one, of course, is the no hard border in Ireland. If we got to the point where we said, look, it's either no deal next week or let's patch something up now, then it's very much in the interest of the EU and Ireland to patch something up. There won't be any border infrastructure on the British side. That's been made clear. It's not necessary at all. But it isn't at all clear what would happen on the EU side. And anybody who reads the Irish papers knows there's been a lot of toing and throwing on this. Will they have to set up some border posts or won't they? If we offered some sort of deal and said, look, we'll sort that out later. We'll have an undertaking on our side of no infrastructure. You do the same. We'll work together to work this out. Why wouldn't they do it? It's better than no deal.
So you're banking on them not giving us concessions, not jumping off.
No. This is in. This is kind of game. This is like game theory.
Yeah.
This is mutually advantageous. You say, look, there are about 3 areas where it's probably more in your interest to settle than in ours, and we have our interests as well. I'm an economist. I think if there's a mutual financial interest, then normally people find a way around it. The trouble here, I think, is the EU Commission, which I think has its own interests in this, which are somewhat different from the interests of the citizens of either Germany, France, Holland, or anywhere else. So I think if you take a sort of bargaining, negotiating framework of this, it really would get quite interesting. It's very obvious that we don't get any of that discussion at all in the UK or in the UK press. It really has been an abysmal experience, the whole process.
I think I'll let Andrew come on.
So I'll try to be reasonably brief to give other people questions, but just to rehearse very briefly. So what do we dislike about the May's deal? So May's deal includes the backstop. So the backstop gives the EU regulatory jurisdiction over Northern Ireland, and it breaks up Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. That means that the UK would be declaring in a border treaty with no exit provision that we would not be sovereign any longer over Northern Ireland's, over the setting of Northern Ireland's main economic laws. That violates the Belfast Agreement. We're not allowed to do that without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. It violates the principle of consent. There is no doubt, should be no doubt that it violates the principle that the UK is sovereign over Northern Ireland. That's exactly why everybody objects to the backstop. And it should be no doubt that violating that principle of sovereignty violates the Belfast Agreement. It's very straightforward. That's the first and most fundamental problem. The second problem with the agreement is that it involves giving £39 billion that we don't owe to the EU for nothing in return. Fine to give them some money in the context of an overall trade agreement. Some of that money had some rationale, so a portion of that money was for us having this period of non-voting membership out to the end of 2020, a little bit less than half. Some of it was for various sorts of projects that go over the longer term. I can talk you through those details. There's only probably about 4 billion of that, which you could argue there was seriously things that we owe, because everybody talks about pensions and stuff like that, but that's actually only that's only about 4 billion in total. And the third aspect of May's deal is it involves us committing to extensive rule-taking. So, for example, Graham mentioned the areas of these non-regression clauses, they're called, on social and environmental and labour laws. We shouldn't be wanting to do any of that, and that certainly shouldn't be in a withdrawal agreement. If anywhere, it would be in a free trade agreement, where you got some quid for your quo. Now, why would it be easier to do afterwards? I think that there are four fairly straightforward reasons to see why it would be easier to do a deal after we left. I thought it would be easy before. I thought it would be easier to do one before. I think I was wrong. It would be easier to do a deal after we've left with no deal. Why? Because first of all, there'll be a new reality established at the Irish border. So there won't be any hard border. The EU will come up with a solution, which means that there are no stop and check controls. Once they've done that, the argument that the only way of achieving those stop and check controls is via the EU being sovereign over the laws of Northern Ireland will completely lapse. So once a new reality is established, then a deal will make things more convenient for them. They'll have an appetite for that. Secondly, a deal is because it's enormously mutually beneficial to have a deal with your major trading partners. And we'll have a deal with the EU for the same reason that Canada's doing a deal with the EU, that Korea's doing a deal with the EU. There'll be a free trade agreement with the EU for exactly the same kind of reasons it does one with other countries. A third reason, I'll probably go on for a while, but the third one, I said I'd be swift, is this, and it's probably the most important. The Brexit negotiations have been totally polluted by the fact that there have been very considerable forces within the United Kingdom that have sought to neuter the process. So it's made it almost infeasible for us to do anything. It's absolutely impossible from the EU side. We've heard repeated declarations that the EU doesn't know what the UK wants. Well, I have enormous sympathy with them. It's not their fault that we come up with completely conflicting things all of the time, because internally there are a set of people who are trying to use the process either to lead us to such an unacceptable outcome that we choose then to remain nonetheless and overturn the referendum, or that we have a non-voting remain relationship over the longer term, so that you remain in fact, if not de jure. And once you take that out of the equation, and so we're in a new relationship where they're then seeking, it's no longer possible for us to remain as members, and in fact you're seeking additions to the EU relationship, it will make things much easier from the EU side, because the UK will have to say we want that, and the EU will say we want that, and then we'll say, well, is that mutually beneficial? Fine, we'll do that. So I think it'll be much easier to do a deal from the outside as it happens.
I noticed you reacting to a few of the sort of bargaining chip points from Graham, Heidi.
I want just to pick up on two things. One is the money, and the other one is this thing with the deal and the backstop of it. Does the UK owe money to the European Union?
No.
Let me give you an example. Have you ever rented an apartment together with a second person? Imagine you and someone else wants to rent an apartment together. You sign a lease for a year. That's a contract. And then after 2 months, your friend decides, oh, actually I don't like the apartment, so I just leave. Good luck with, paying the rest of the rent.
Did you have a deal with them that said you could leave after a month?
Contract.
Did you have a contract with your partner that said you could leave after a month? Well, we do in the European Union. We have the Lisbon Treaty says we can leave after 2 years.
Can I follow my thing? The problem is that the UK committed to the European budget. We have certain years where policies are planned, Erasmus, for example, student exchanges. The EU is having to pay this until 2020, no matter if the UK pays in or not. The UK committed to joint policies and to a budget.
Lots of members.
What does it do to an association if then suddenly you turn around and say, oh yeah, I just changed my mind, goodbye?
I don't think we're saying that for a minute.
You should not underestimate, again, the kind of damage this kind of rhetoric does to the international role of the United Kingdom. If you talk to international trade negotiators, everyone says, well, that's a good example, you can't trust them. don't underestimate the element of trust in international relations. So that's the
So
thing.
we weren't allowed to leave, right? We weren't allowed to leave until 2020. Is that what you're saying?
You're allowed to leave, but you can't just say, oh yeah, we're not paying the rest of our fees. That's part of the withdrawal.
But the fees are membership fees, right? So they're fees for members. So we agreed what the schedule of fees for members were, and we were allowed to
Yes.
leave. So why would we pay membership fees for periods we're not a member?
But the thing is that you committed to policy, and for now the UK is still a member.
We've agreed to pay that. There's no doubt about that.
No, but that's what it is about.
No, that's only part of it. We're talking about different parts of it.
Okay. Then let me come to the second thing about the Irish backstop and the border issue. I mean, again, not being British, I don't dare talking about Northern Ireland. I have to say I learned more about Northern Ireland and the troubles there in the last 2 years than I wanted to. And I'm sometimes really just speechless of how uncareful people are in opening a conflict that it took so long to settle. Really? You want to hold the Northern Ireland border issue as a bargaining chip?
No.
But that's what you just stated in terms of
No.
game theory.
No, absolutely not.
You're
There's
talking-
nothing in the Belfast Agreement about the border.
No, you're talking about somebody else, I'm afraid.
Okay, good. Apparently we keep talking about something else. When it comes to this game theory thing too, you mentioned you want a deal. How many partners are normally necessary to make a deal? In game theory, how many partners do you have? 2. Can you have an agreement if only one of them constantly says what they want without considering what the other side wants? According to game theory, that doesn't work. But that's in the end, I think, one of the messages that keep being kept sent to the European Union. We want a border because we want to have sovereignty over a border, and we don't want to be in the customs union, but we don't want a border because, we can't do it according to the Belfast Agreement. Well, at some point you have to make a decision.
We have.
But it has to be a decision that is workable. And just sitting there and repeating the same things time and again just makes you lose trust that, there is going to be a deal. And I think that's where we are at the moment. The European Union is very clear. They don't want a no-deal situation. But there's very little trust that it will still be workable because we keep hearing the same things time and again.
And stop trying to claim bits of our territory. It'd be much easier to do a deal if you don't claim a bit of our territory.
I'm not going to respond to this argument and to yield the floor.
Actually, I'm just thinking to myself, 27, I'm sure there's lots of students who are seeing people leaving the room. It'd be rather good to hear points.
Yeah, let's get some more questions.
It'd be quite good to hear students taking maybe 4 or 5 points. And,
let's have that 4 or 5.
I'm happy to pass up.
Perfect.
And I've got things to say about the backstop and stuff, but I'm sure that people are burning to make questions, burning to make points.
You're right. Let's do that.
It'd be good to involve our audience.
Right. In that case, we can take a few questions or points at a time if people have any. Yes, that's right. We'll go from left to right with 3 points.
So you've talked about it not being democratic to not go through with Brexit, but do you think Brexit in the first place was a democratic thing to ask? Was it fair to ask they wanted to leave the European Union, given the fact that they didn't even know if it was possible and they themselves didn't believe in the project? And in that sense, also, do you think that in some ways Brexit, so one of the main reasons that people voted for Brexit was parliamentary sovereignty, but do you not think that Brexit's actually undermined parliamentary sovereignty and replaced it with popular sovereignty? And what do you think the long-term implications of that will be?
We'll take a point from over there as well. We'll take a series of points. And
that's a good,
I just thought it was interesting what we were saying about the 2016 vote representing kind of this pure will of the people, and that there was nothing wrong with it when it's been found that Vote Leave broke the law in their campaigning, and secondly that it was such a kind of arbitrary question that even on the panel we can hear that Leave means so many different things to so many people. So I just think to talk about that vote as if it's this sort of pure will of the people that can never be changed when actually there's so many things wrong with it in the first place.
The question I just had is for the discussion in terms of the backstop, the fact that the EU is going to come up with some solution. And there's been lots of solutions going around, such as like technical advances and having a technical, like not a physical border, but just working electronically. Given there is no system in place currently in the world that does this, what solution are we suggesting that they're going to come up with?
We can. Okay, right.
Yeah, my question is for Will, because I agree that I think a lot of people probably voted because of this like shit life syndrome. But given they did vote for those reasons and because their circumstances were so dire, and they voted in spite of all of the Project Fear, what makes you think they would have now changed their minds and vote Remain, even though they're probably still really angry and their circumstances won't have improved over the last 3 years?
Okay, we'll start with Will in that case with these points.
Well, look, I mean, I think that well, there's some good points made here. I mean, I'd like just to address two of them. And if we don't, the point of representative democracy and the point about shit life syndrome. I mean, first of all, I mean, you are right. I mean, we have you made the point yourself. I mean, there is a kind of, it is, a first order constitutional crisis we're living through. I mean, it's an economic crisis and it's a social crisis, but it's an economic, it's a political constitutional crisis. And you can see both our major parties are fragmenting in front of the tensions over it, but also there's, there's a crisis about, the degree to which the executive, I have not realised, that's what I should have done, I guess but I haven't realised the degree to which the executive will control the legislative programme of the House of Commons until this really. The government of the day, we don't have any checks and balances in the UK. And then you have this point about, who rule, what trumps who. I mean, does this, is one compelled to kind of, having had this vote, to actually do it, despite the fact that doing it is so harmful, because you have to respect democracy, you have to kind of, because representatives are meant, in Burkean terms, to do the best they can for their constituents and in the light of changing circumstances. I mean, even manifestos of political parties, they get elected on something, but actually, as circumstances change over the life of a parliament, they change policies, have to do it. And actually, our representatives, I want them to do that. I want my representatives. I don't want them to be delegates. That's another thing that's appeared in both political parties. The Conservative Constituents Party Association in Grantham wants Nick Bowles to be a delegate, not a representative. And actually, there's a kind of deselection in lots of, my understanding is that a number of Tory MPs who are Remainers have only managed to avert being reselected because they promise they'll stand down in the next general election. Meanwhile, on the Labour side, the threat of deselection is all around. And so it's moving from, the notion we had that we elected kind of our MPs to be our representatives to being our delegates. Delegates actually enthrall to party leaderships who are carrying out this will of the people that was very imperfectly kind of argued about, I would say, and actually is powerfully going to impoverish us. I mean, what are you meant to do as an MP? And it's absolutely fundamental. And I think some of one is I think we have to do as a national community, and you guys doing PPE at Oxford are going to be part of this conversation. We're going to have to reconfigure our constitution. We're going to have one. I mean, at least in the States, Donald Trump faces. He may win again in 2020, but at least actually there's a well-structured system of checks and balances and system of constitutional government. Here we, and what are the perverse consequence of the Parliament Act that the coalition government introduced? You have a 2/3 majority in the House of Commons before you can actually dissolve Parliament. It means that, these guys are locked into the House of Commons as currently configured unless they can get a 2/3 majority. But could they, to dissolve Parliament, have a general election? The whole thing is a mess. Whatever Brexit has done, I think what it's done is and I'm sometimes asked, are there any good things about Brexit? I think, one, I think it has shattered right-wing economic thinking for a generation. Two, I think it is forcing and will force us to have a constitutional settlement that we've always averted, and we've gone on with this unwritten constitution. And thirdly, I think it's going to really make us look at our divided country in the eye and think how we can reconfigure it, which segues into this kind of point about the shit lice syndrome people in Blackpool. I mean, MPs who represent northern constituencies tell me, in all my enthusiasm for a people's vote, and actually, their electorate will vote even more to remain now, to leave now than they did in 2016. I mean, things have got worse. And actually, it's all very well, and Jeremy Corbyn and co campaigning to remain, as I hope they will, and saying that it's that opens up the prospect of a general election in which you can elect a Labour government, and we will then put in place an economic and social programme that will address your ills. I mean, that has to be the kind of sell. But I mean, how credible that's going to be is a moot point, and I concede your point. I mean, I'm by no means certain that we would win a second referendum. I mean, the opinion polls suggest that opinion has moved in a lot of Leave constituencies. Places like Swindon and Sunderland, I think, would vote Remain now, rather than Leave as they did. And there's a lot of other constituencies like that. But the places like Chorley or Stoke, which were Don Valley, Caroline Flint, Doncaster, I think they'll vote Leave again, and maybe in bigger numbers. So it's a very, I'm by no means confident we'll do it, but I think we should put it to people a second time. The reasons I've elaborated this evening.
Okay, Heidi, and if we can keep our answers brief.
Sorry about that, short answer for me now.
I will keep it very brief and not answer so necessarily questions, but perhaps pick up one point that touches some of them, and that's also this question, is it fair to ask people if they want to be a member of the European Union? Yes, absolutely. And probably our governments waited too long. If you think about, who signed the Maastricht Treaty, who signed the Lisbon Treaty, it was not that the UK government wasn't there. They were the representatives of the United Kingdom. But what probably all member states in the European Union did too little is ensure to have this conversation, what does it mean to be a member state of the European Union? And what I find so interesting in the Brexit discussion is this idea of sovereignty, that if you leave the European Union, you get your sovereignty back. The EU never took your sovereignty. The one thing that is happening in the European Union that we pool sovereignty. You make decisions in a collective because together you can achieve more. I'm always laughing, I'm from Austria. If Austria decides to have environmental standards to save the planet, lovely for us, but it's not going to work. If we do it in the European Union, much more likely. And I think that's this misconception that there is, that if you're a member of the European Union, you lose your sovereignty. And there's also this misconception that if you leave the European Union, you get your sovereignty back, which means that from now on you can do whatever you want and you can achieve whatever you want. The world does not work like that anymore. We know that a lot what nowadays governments are doing is managing interdependence, trying to come up with policies that turn this interdependence into positive elements for the societies. And that goes perhaps back to this question about, economic downturn and people who feel left behind. Yes, Europe, all the member states, and the European Union probably did too little to think of what is happening to our societies. How can we make sure that no one feels left behind? But again, if Austria decides, the only solution against it is leaving the European Union and hiding in our mountains, I think it's quite visible that this can't be the solution to that. So yes, we need actually more discussion of what does it mean to be an EU member? What are the kind of society that Europe wants to be in 50 years' term with changing international context? But I think we should stop pretending that, just because we alone make the decisions, we will be able, to decide what happens in the world. Not just Europe anymore. But this time is gone.
Briefly, Graham?
Clearly, there are some decisions we will be able to make. I mean, the big issue in the referendum was on migration. After we leave, we will be able to control migration into the EU. We may decide not to control it, we may decide to do this or do that, but it'll be our decision. We'll regain some sovereignty in that area. The only question I really want to take up here, I'll leave referenda for others, is the Northern Ireland border technology. Phoebe, I think it's Phoebe's question. I lived and worked in Northern Ireland for 25 years through about half of the Troubles. I still live there partly, I was there yesterday. So I've taken quite a big interest in this. And I've listened to a lot of the evidence given by European customs experts to the Northern Ireland Select Committee. Hours and hours of explaining how this can work. So we can do this with existing European techniques. For instance, the Association of Customs Brokers explains that if you want to send a lorry from Rotterdam to Zurich out of the EU, all the checks and everything are done online, and they're done by the brokers before the lorry ever leaves. The only check that there currently is that the driver has to swipe a card as he crosses the Swiss border. Nobody stops him or anything. Just do that. The only reason for that, and this has been very poorly understood, the only reason for doing that card swipe is in case there's any dispute about whether customs dues are owed to the EU or to Switzerland. This can be insurance. If the lorry went missing, had it already crossed the border or hadn't it, are the dues to be paid? That's such a small issue that we could. I mean, the customs experts we need to do that. Do that some other way. So lorries are doing this all the time across the Swiss border. No checks at all. And these experts, Swedish and Dutch experts, tell us there's no reason why we shouldn't do that on the Irish border. HMRC agreed. The Irish Customs Authority also agrees. And for political reasons, the Irish government, and even more disturbingly and mystifyingly, the British government, don't want to listen to this. These experts, by the way, have never been approached by any official from the UK civil service. They don't want to know. So the lesson we must draw from this is that Theresa May made up her mind very early on that she wanted the UK to stay in the customs union, and Northern Ireland has been, the Irish border has been a convenient stick to argue that.
So I'll be very brief. So on the point here, referendum is a terrible way of deciding almost anything, and I've always been opposed to referendum. I argued against having a referendum on the European Union for many years. The fact that it's a terrible way of doing things, I would, for example, I'm opposed to PR. Suppose that you had a proportional representation election. I don't think the fact that I was opposed to PR would mean that after the election occurred, I would say, oh, well, we shouldn't have any of these MPs or MEPs or whatever it was that was chosen under that system. You have the system, and then you respect the system, even if it's a bad system. So it was a bad system, I agree. I think it's a particularly bad system, and we should absolutely never again have any referendum other than of the form executive says X versus status quo. What we had in this case was that the executive favours status quo, and then we have X. So then when you choose X, there's no one to do it. Right? So that's just a terrible way of arranging a referendum. The only kind of referendum you should have is a referendum on a change where the executive is proposing a change. If you have a referendum, it's terrible. Second, look, Remain, there were some Vote Leave campaigners who were fined for various things. There have been Remain campaigners who have been fined for various expenditure irregularities as well. It doesn't get much press, but that's happened as well. Nobody thinks that those kinds of things made the remotest bit of difference to the result. In fact, there have been there was an attempt to explicitly claim that at the High Court, which the court just threw out completely. The reality of this is that the Remain side spent enormously more than the Leave side, so some spending irregularities. Okay, you shouldn't do it, but it doesn't change anything. I want to just say one more thing on this border thing. So, by and large, I agree with Graham on this question. I think that there isn't any. I think it's a completely manufactured issue. I've led projects for I happen to lead the project for the European Commission assessing its e-customs regime. There's no reason why these kinds of things, the kinds of existing technologies, it's not about some new fancy technology. People talk about these as if you needed to do some new thing. It's all things that already exist. It's just and that's part of the reason, by the way, why we should have no faith in this idea that the backstop is never going to be executed. What the EU has rejected all of the methods which already exist. So it isn't going to suddenly start saying, well, we now think it's going to be okay if you have an arrangement. It's going to force us into the backstop because it's already committed to doing that. What I think that they may do, though, in the meantime, which you might buy if you don't like the idea of these solutions, is the following. I think that they will institute checks on goods where there are already checks on persons, namely at the Schengen border, what I call the Celtic Sea border. So between Ireland and France, or other ports, the goods going into Ireland or coming from Ireland, probably mainly, they will check them. And so the Irish projects will be subject to some checks there, and there will be they will constrain the area of these maximum facilitation type approaches to the island of Ireland itself. Then I think what will happen is you'd end up over time with an agreement in slightly moving certain things around. So I think that the Northern Ireland Assembly would agree to coordinate its SPS rules, its animal and plant health and welfare rules with those of Ireland. So you have one island of Ireland regime. After all, there's already checks on live animals that go into the UK. In fact, there are 32 areas, I believe, of checks, correct me, on the things that go between Ireland and Great Britain already. So it shouldn't be an objection in principle to doing that. So I think that you would, with goodwill, have some manipulation of exactly how much was done at the Celtic Sea border versus the Irish Sea border, and you'd have maximum facilitation on the island of Ireland. I'll stop there.
Before we wrap up, I'd just like to ask a closing one-word answer question. Right, one word. When
Question in one word.
the answer.
Oh, the answer.
Yes. When each of you hears about the current Brexit situation, what's the first word or adjective that comes to mind?
Shambles.
What's this? Fuck, actually.
Inexorable.
Disillusioned.
And on that note, thank all of our panelists for what was a fascinating panel, and let's give them a round of applause.